Gauri Viswanathan's Masks of Conquest, Literary Study and British Rule in India was published in 1989. Using Gramscian model of hegemony, Gauri Viswanathan analyzes the relationship between British political and commercial interests and the establishment of English literature as an academic discipline in India. The book describes the introduction of English studies in India under British rule and illuminates the discipline's transcontinental movements and derivations, showing that the origins of English studies are as diverse and diffuse as its future shape. She argues that the circular study of English can no longer be understood innocently of or inattentively to the imperial context in which the discipline first articulated its mission. Vishwanathan sketches the development of English studies among colonial cultures in India as a distinctive and defining characteristic of their culture. Her aim is to understand not just the introduction of English literary studies and how its content has been modified to meet the administrative and political imperatives of British rule, but also the way in which these imperatives have charged that content with a radically altered significance, enabling the humanistic ideals of the Enlightenment to coexist with and to even support education for social and political control. The Indian response to this project is perceived in terms of the hegemonic activities of the educated middle classes within colonial parameters. Vishwanathan makes it clear that the literary curriculum was introduced in India not to demonstrate the superiority of English culture, but rather to disguise the economic exploitation of the colonized people. In spite of the vigorous efforts made by the secularized government schools to introduce English literature to the natives, as well as the more uneasy efforts made by the Christian missionary schools, the British government was ultimately responsible for ensuring its authority and for creating a stable state in which the British mercantile and military interests could flourish. Vishwanathan points out in the last of six central chapters the inherent contradictions in the colonial project of creating an educated elite in the colonial era. The literary curriculum not only created a dissatisfied class who did not have any suitable employment opportunities, but also highlighted the shortcomings of the system that advocated both social control as well as social advancement. As a result of the Charter Act of 1813, according to Vishwanathan, England committed itself fully to educating its native subjects, a process which it had not been required to do with its own citizens at that time. Her analysis of the parliamentary debates around that time demonstrates the complexity of the British response to this new challenge at the time. By the time English was introduced as a medium of instruction in 1835, there were already conflicts between the official Western education and the missionary education that were already evident. Vishwanathan emphasizes, among many other things, that the honor accorded to literary studies in the secular curriculum of the government schools and the secular curriculum of the missionary schools is one of the many things that she stresses in her contrasting analysis of the secular curriculums of the government schools and the missionary schools. But while the importance of moral instruction was seen as an imperative in the training of Indians in the serious task of administering the empire, the missionary claims for the Bible were not heeded. Moreover, the diversity of Indian society and its linguistic variety protected the purity of the English language and institutions from the erosion it inevitably faced in England. Strategically, the study of history was prescribed as a step toward freeing the native from the tyranny of form, so that the discordancies of Hindu society were forced into the open. In her analysis of the role of history in the curriculum, Vishwanathan demonstrates how, in fact, far from alienating the Indian from his own culture, background, and traditions, English education gained the image of being an agency for restoring Indian youth to an essential self and, in turn, reinserting him into the course of Western civilization. Indigenous modes of coping with colonial hegemonic practices, as well as the hegemonic activities of the rising middle class of India, reveal the attractions of an English education. Despite the ever present dominant colonial discourse, English education offered opportunities to explore other landscapes, voyages into territories other than the geographical enclave where the dominant held power. It was in this space that the self styled leaders of a cultural revolt chose to set up their platform, a space in which they could universalize their specific situation. By ignoring these aspects of its appeal, the hegemonic appears to be described in terms of imposition rather than of the interactions and the maintenance of alliance of a class with other social forces. Vishwanathan notes with some irony the fulfillment of the Macaulayan dream in her consideration of essays written by Indian students justifying the colonial need for trade and territorial expansion without taking adequate notice of the subterranean struggles involved. Moreover, such instances, when interpreted simply as the internalization of colonial ideas, miss the hidden dissenting voice which becomes apparent when reading such evidence against other sources written with a different audience in mind. Vishwanathan uses a variety of resources in order to illustrate the continual modification of the British educational goals that have resulted in the discipline of English studies today. This book serves as a reminder that educational systems and curriculum developments need to be viewed historically. This intellectual history of British educational practice in India by Vishwanathan is a combination of an examination of the relationship between power and culture, as well as an examination of the exploitative tendencies of the ruling class.